Thank you for inviting me to speak on this conference, which has been very good, harrowing to listen to and hear from the other speakers. I don't know that my presentation will make us feel any happier because I think what I want to do in this presentation is present what is going on in general on the economic front in the Middle East in relation to the imperialist intervention in the Middle East. So I'll be looking at the economics of imperialism in the Middle East. To do that, I wish to share some graphs with you, which I hope I can now do. I'm hoping you can see that, everybody. Is that correct?
Yes, we can see it.
Good. Okay, so this is the title of my short presentation. And what I'm going to deal with is some of the economic trends that are going on with imperialism in general, and then look at how that is impacting or affecting the situation in the Middle East, and particularly, of course, in Gaza and the West Bank. Here is a rather unclear, perhaps, graph, but what it shows is that imperialism, that's the big countries of the so-called global north, the G7 economies of Europe, Japan, and the United States, because they have higher technology, superiority in international trade across a range of commodities, because they can also exploit low wages and conditions in the so-called global south, they're able to make abilities to transfer a considerable proportion of profits made out of the workers of the global south and the global north through international trade from into their countries. So if you look on the left-hand side of the graph, you can see that the big G7 economies, Western Europe, Australia, and Oceania, North America, East Asia, these countries every year are getting extra dollars per person. This is a measure of dollars per person each year over the last 25 years. So every year, the Western Europe's population, of course, they're not receiving it themselves, but there is an increase, an inflow of about $12 or $13 per person per year through international trade. And that is coming from the global south countries. So if we look at the other side of the equation, you can see that there's a huge loss of value and dollars going out of the countries and the regions of the global south. I have highlighted the Middle East, which has one of the highest transfers of value, just under $19 per person in the Middle East, going from the Middle East into the global north countries every year through the process of trade and transfers of value. So that is, if you like, the economic mechanism of imperialism through trade, which is taking place across the world. And of course, it affects the countries and the economies of the Middle East just as much. As you can see, North Africa has the biggest loss per person every year. The second graph shows the other way in which imperialism is extracting income and value out of the global south. This is the transfers of rent, profit, interest across borders from one country to another through the process of repatriation of profits by companies, through the process of banks collecting interest and sending it back to their home base, through other methods of transfers of incomes and remittances. And I'm just isolated here the Middle East economies, and you can see that there's quite a large income transfer into the oil states of Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, Saudis, and so on. Even a small transfer before, of course, we're talking of the Holocaust we've had up to now, but the Palestine got a slight increase, mainly through transfers from the other parts of the Middle East. But you can see the rest of the Middle East, including, surprisingly, Israel, has had a transfer of income out of the economy net every year. Just a small amount in the case of Israel, but huge amounts every year in the case of Turkey and Egypt. So $100 billion every year is leaving Egypt through transfers of rent, income, and interest to the global north countries. It's not from Egypt to Kuwait, it's from Egypt to the US, to Europe, and so on. I'm just showing you how the transfers are taking place for each individual country. Also, another way in which there's a huge transfer of income out of the global south countries, including the Middle East, is through the return that you get on assets, so the profitability of the assets of a country got. So if a country invests in another country, its company invests in another country, it gets a return on that. But that return can vary from country to country. And if you take into account the returns that other countries are getting in investing in your country, then the net position tells you whether there's a transfer of income taking place. And this is a measure by the World Inequality Lab in Paris with Thomas Piketty. They've looked at the net yield on assets and
Excuse me, but we are trying to fix the translation locally. On Zoom it's working, but locally it's not working. So can you just give us 1 minute?
Yes, sure.
Thanks.
It's working, thank you. You can
continue. Well, it might, these graphs are complicated, so I hope that people have followed to some extent what is going on. If not, I'm not going to repeat it. But as you can see with net yield, that's the amount of money per investment relative to how much is invested into your country. You can see that most of the, not nearly all of the Middle East economies are having a transfer of income out of their economies into other countries, presumably the global north, and a massive reduction or loss in yield on their assets compared to their liabilities. In the case of Yemen, at 8% of all their assets and liabilities, right across the board, and only a very small positive position for the Lebanon and the United Arab Emirates. So the whole of the Middle East sees a huge transfer of income because the assets that they've invested abroad, including the oil-rich states, is not sufficient to cover the extraction that's being taken place by the imperialist economies. So those three graphs that I presented are the general picture that exists through the imperialist extraction, or through trade, through profits, through income from bank interest, and through the yield that they can get on their investments that they make in the global south, and in this case in the Middle East. There is a continual annual huge transfer of profit, interest and income from the Middle East, including the oil-rich states, to the global north of Europe, Japan and the United States. That's the economic mechanism of imperialism. If we look at Middle East in itself, we can see a breakdown, in my view, into different sections, a taxonomy of the Middle East. This is a measure of the Human Development Index. So this is from 0.4 to 1. That's the Human Development Index, which is made up by the United Nations. The Human Development Index measures various components. The per capita income in each country, that's the level of living standards, if you like, in each country, the level of educational attainment in each country, life expectancy in each country, and some other factors. It combines that together in a Human Development Index, and on the basis of that, you can see that the oil-rich states, including then in this case Israel as the agent of imperialism, have fairly high Human Development Index levels, above or around about 0.9. But when we get to the non-oil states, which are the brighter yellow colors here, Egypt, Jordan, we can see that that's much lower. So the human development levels in Egypt and Jordan are considerably lower than they are in the oil-rich states of the Middle East. And when we get to what I call the broken states, those that are really not functioning in any way in the benefit of meeting the needs of their people at all, when we get down to Iraq, although it's an oil state, it is very low leveled because of its split condition after the invasions, 2 invasions by the United States and so-called allies. And then we come to the states that we see at the moment with Syria and Yemen. So that Yemen has a Human Development Index. Its level of human development is half that of the level of the United Arab Emirates. And of course, If we then look at Palestine, we can see that it is way, way down, something like only 40% of the position that exists in the UAE. 40% is just a figure, but it demonstrates how the terrible situation that exists for human development in the whole of the Palestine area. And of course, one of the main reasons for the fact that there is no possibility for improvements of human development in the West Bank, even before the beginning of the genocidal attack by Israel in October 23, is down to the fact that investment and aid and support for the West Bank and Gaza is absolutely almost down to zero. That's dollars per person in 2024. Palestinians got $18 per person in 2024 towards helping them to develop the economy or just to survive. And you can see all the Arab states here who got relatively higher figures, much higher than Palestine, but still very low compared to the big oil states like the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And of course, Israel, which gets, despite its situation in the position, gets a very high level of inward investment from the global north in particular. And if we look at the position on military expenditure, I think this shows what sort of aid Israel is getting in addition to just general investment by other countries and by the multinationals and banks around the world. Here is the measure of the military expenditure in dollars million. On the left-hand side of the graph, you can see that Saudi Arabia is getting something like $80 billion a year invested into military expenditure, which is equivalent to something like 7% of its GDP. That's the size of Saudi Arabia's military spending as a percentage of GDP and in total per year. Israel not far behind in terms of size, 46 billion, but nearly 9% of its GDP goes on military spending in order to maintain its position in the region. Turkey follows after that, but the rest, although we can see this line here suggests that 5 or 6% of GDP for many of the Middle Eastern states, until you get down to Lebanon having the lowest amount of investment in military spending. So military spending is a key factor in Israel's dominance of the region and its ability to control and dominate over the rest of the Middle East. And of course, behind that is really the US military industrial complex in the Middle East. Israel has been the top recipient of US arms sales for the last 70 years. It lies in 63 billion in 2024. That's an average across the whole areas. You can see an average of 63 billion. Only Saudi Arabia really is bigger than that over the last 20 years or so. And as we work through some of the other countries which receive US military and industrial aid, you can see that nowhere near matches the level that Israel is getting on a basis every year after adjusting for inflation. And that funding, maintaining Israel's military expenditure, it's a power to dominate the region, of course, primarily comes from the United States. Israel is the largest cumulative recipient of US aid since 1946. You can see that it gets a considerable amount of economic aid, something like nearly 100 billion in the last 70 years, but the majority of the aid that it gets from the United States is military aid. Something like $250 billion have been sent to Israel for aid on their military spending. And you can see, if you look down the list of this on the left, you can see the sort of countries that have been receiving US aid over the last 70 years. Afghanistan, Vietnam, Iraq, Ukraine, South Korea, India, Turkey, France, Pakistan, but nothing matches the level of investment in military aid that the United States has made for Israel. As a result of that, of course, we can see that Israel has the powerful weaponry to destroy Gaza, the West Bank, and also carry out its attacks on other parts of the Middle East, including Iran. In the latest position we have in 2020, up to September 2025, $21 billion have been invested by the US in military aid to Israel, and US military operations in the Yemen and Iran and the wider region constituting between 10 and 12 billion just in the last year and a half since October 2023. So a total nearly of 34 billion has been spent now by the US in supporting Israel's destruction of Gaza, the West Bank, and its attacks on Iran and other countries. And just the latest update on the impact that has had upon Palestine, reported again today, I think, in the papers, but we now have a figure, and this was on the 19th of November, of just over 70,000 people killed in the aggression since October the 7th, 180,000 injured, 2 million displaced, 18,700 detainees, and we've just been discussing what situation they're in, and 192,000 damaged buildings in the Palestine area of Gaza as of towards the end of November. That is the impact that imperialism has had, using Israel as the agent to crush any opposition towards self-determination, towards improving the living standards and conditions of people in the region in order to maintain the position and occupation that has existed for decades now. So we have extreme poverty in the state of Palestine. The latest figures, according to the UN's UNCTAD organization, 74% of the people in Palestine are now officially, by even the minimum standards, regarded in poverty, 74%. That's 4.1 million, including 2.6 million who've been newly impoverished by the events in Gaza over the last 18 months or more. And if we look at another measure of multi-dimensional poverty, which includes freedom of movement, monetary resources, unemployment, access to healthcare, school enrollment, we can see a tripling of the level of poverty in the Palestine area from 10% in 2017, bad enough, to now 30% who are officially classified as being in poverty in terms of multi-dimensional poverty. Human development has collapsed. This is again the Human Development Index for the West Banks and Gaza, and you can see that before there was no war, Gaza was about 0.73 low by international standards, even by the Global South standards. But after the continuing war, Gaza's human development has fallen from around 70, that's down to 40, or around, so a drop of something like 40% in human development during the continued war that we've had now. In the West Bank, the fall has been less, but even so, there still has been a decline. Most economies, most countries are slowly, gradually improving their human development index as measured by the UN. But in the case of Gaza, it's a disaster. In the case of the West Bank, it's a decline and a significant reduction in just the general level of human development as defined by the UN. What could have been different? And this is an UNCTAD graph just released, which says that if there had been no war, even under the conditions that existed before October 7th, if that and they had received the same sort of level of aid and investment that would have been possible then, and that was limited enough, there would have been an expansion in West Bank gross domestic product going upwards on this alternative scenario, this straight line trajectory, with perhaps a drop in 2020, as you see, due to the pandemic slump, and then a continued rise. Not very good, very low levels per in millions of constant 2015 dollars. But because of the October events and the subsequent occupation by Israel and the destruction of Gaza and the interference and breaking up of West Bank, that's what the situation is now across the board in the West Bank, a collapse in gross domestic product. Went way, way below where it would have been even before October 2023. And here is the very latest data on Gaza from UNCTAD. We see a fall in real gross domestic product per capita from about 2,500, to being generous, in the 1990s, a gradual decline you can see in Gaza's real domestic product per capita right up until 2012, then a further accelerating decline during the 2010s, and then the catastrophe that we've seen now, so that basically real domestic product per capita is heading towards almost zero in the case of Gaza compared to where it was just 25 years ago. And finally, the graph on this right, I must bring this to your attention. UNCTAD have made this. Here is the average nighttime luminosity in the period between September and October 2023. You could see at night there was quite a lot of light in Gaza. Then during the occupation and destruction, gradually lights go out at night. And this is where we are now in 2025. There is nothing left. Gaza is now not only devastated, but also utterly dark and destroyed. My conclusion, therefore, is that imperialism is represented by finance capital, multinational companies and military forces operating in the Middle East has held back economic prosperity in the region for decades and continues to do so. But a unique feature of the region, because imperialism is doing that everywhere in a way, the unique feature of the region is the direct agent that imperialism used to control the region, which is namely the Israeli state. And that state is supplied and financed by the imperialist core, particularly the US. And until that imperialist axis is broken, there is no hope for economic recovery for the millions living in the Middle East. Thank you for your time.